You're up then, followed by Senator Kennedy.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Swagel. It's good to see you again. Let me just start on the revenue side because I'm looking at the CBO projections, and I see that, a number of months ago, you had projected that the Trump tax cuts would add, well, this is back during that time, $4.6 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. I understand you had an earlier exchange with the chairman. The Trump tax cuts did not pay for themselves despite claims, right?
Yes. That's correct. That's what we
And your projection is that if we just did a straight extension of the tax cuts, those would not pay for themselves either, would they?
No, they wouldn't.
So one of the arguments that was made at the time was that the trickle-down economics was going to work, right? I'm looking at the projections that were made by the Trump economic team. They predicted that tax plan would generate 4 to 6% growth in GDP. But then I'm looking at the 7 quarters that succeeded that, and so this is data before the COVID pandemic hit. And I'm seeing that growth actually during that period of time was not appreciably different than the growth during the prior 7 quarters. There was a small bump in Q2 of 2018 to 3.5%, but that was the same as Q4 of 2017 before enactment of the Trump tax. So this whole theory of trickle-down economics was behind the claims that the tax cuts were going to pay for themselves, right?
That would be the way that, in principle, a tax cut could pay for itself if it generates so much additional output that comes back as revenue. Right. The analysis CBO did in 2018 was that there would be some impact. There'd be some impact on business investment and then some additional revenue. It was about an 18% fiscal feedback. So, so something. And the challenge was that, as you said, we saw a little bit of a, higher growth early in 2018. And then in the middle of 2018, tariffs were raised, and those looked to have affected business investment. And so in some sense, even before the pandemic, if there were macro effects of the tax cut, those got in some sense, offset or hidden by the, by trade policy.
And I looked at the CBO analysis and I saw some of the feedback loop, and I think you attribute those primarily to some of the corporate tax cuts. But let me ask you on the individual side, the claims that, big personal tax cuts for wealthy people was going to generate something like in the range of 4.6%. I mean, that was just ridiculous, right?
The CBO didn't have those kind of figures.
You're being diplomatic, but and of course claims going forward that continuing that Trump tax cuts would pay for themselves, as you said, is absurd. I will point out that if you look at the analyses that were done by the Tax Policy Center, they point out that extending the Trump tax cuts would provide more than twice the benefit for the top 1% than for the entire the bottom 60% as a percentage of their income. In real dollars, that translates to an average $48,000 tax cut for households in the top 1%, about $500 for those in the bottom 60%. So it makes no sense to add even more to our deficits to disproportionately benefit those at the very top. I will point out that President Biden has committed to making sure that any tax benefits that apply to people $400,000 and under will be maintained. But it does seem a total, a stupid and backwards policy to extend those that provided big breaks to the wealthy that did not have the so-called trickle-down growth benefit, but did add to the deficit. In my remaining time, I'd just like to ask you about the recent cuts to the IRS. As you know, as part of the budget deal last year, there was a $20 billion clawback. What is your best estimate of how much that will add to the deficit over time?
So our calculations are that $1 of additional resources to the IRS generates about $2 of revenue, so a net of 1. So the rescission of funding to the IRS that's why it increased the deficit in our projections.
Right,
So
so could-
roughly, 2 to 1.
So it was $20 billion cut, so your estimate is that, what, it will lose $40 billion?
About 40 billion in revenue. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Kennedy of the great state of Louisiana.